At the beginning of this story, we meet a boy named Mai Lu, a half-human, half-vampire mutant known as the Child of Peace. But for unknown reasons, his parents abandoned him, leaving him to spend his childhood in a laboratory as an orphan. Even as he grew older, Mai Lu was treated cruelly by both sides, which led him to become a criminal until one day he met a girl who was just like him. The two fell in love, but the world was not kind to them. However, before all this happened, a white car was being chased by dozens of police cars that didn't hesitate to shoot. The criminals inside the car seemed undeterred, while the white-haired boy continued driving without showing much concern. The girl next to him was in a completely different state, terrified of the possible consequences and wondering what would happen if they were captured or, worse yet, killed during their escape. The white-haired boy reassured the girl that they would be fine and handed her a bag. When the girl opened the bag, she found some flash grenades. Without hesitation, she grabbed the grenades and threw them at the pursuing police cars. The explosions completely disrupted the police formation and gave the two the opportunity to escape through the tunnel. However, suddenly, a truck appeared in front of them with the BST logo emblazoned on it. The BST was a special task force created to deal with a particular type of human that had appeared 30 years earlier, after a terrible epidemic caused by a pharmaceutical company responsible for creating a drug intended to help people suffering from severe cases of insomnia. Unfortunately, the drug had hidden side effects that transformed many patients into blood-sucking monsters that later became known as bloodivores. The pharmaceutical company was sued by the victims and still faced trials even after all these years. The company's defense was that it had always sought the good of humanity and never expected the drug to have such side effects. But the people were furious and demanded only that those doctors and chemists be arrested for creating something so dangerous. The victims of this incident came to be called bloodivores. These beings felt a thirst for blood like vampires, but unlike in the movies, their skin didn't burn in the sunlight. They were also forced to wear special monitoring collars that sent signals to the BST whenever a bloodivore began to stir with hunger for blood. On a seemingly calm day, two young men sat at a table outside a cafe discussing part of their upcoming mission. The white-haired man on the right was Mai Lu, who was also a bloodivore, as evidenced by the collar around his neck. The brown-haired man on the left was Wen Kao, also a bloodivore. The two were discussing a bank robbery they had been planning for days. During their conversation, they noticed a beautiful woman standing on the sidewalk, but suddenly a man jumped on her from behind, his eyes crazed with bloodlust. This man also wore a monitoring collar, making it clear that he, too, was a bloodivore. The woman screamed in fear, knowing what her fate would soon be. Unfortunately, no one intervened to help her, and the attacker was free to suck her blood at will. The woman simply writhed in pain as her life ebbed away, and only when she stopped moving did the man release her. At that moment, two members of the task force arrived and shot the bloodivore without hesitation. They continued to beat him with batons until he completely stopped moving and lay dead on the ground. When Kao, who was watching from afar, clenched his fists in anger at seeing one of his own being so brutally slaughtered. Soon after, a young woman appeared and warned Mai Lu that they shouldn't rob the bank that day, as the special forces were already nearby. Mai Lu replied that she shouldn't worry, as it made the situation even more suitable for action. While the agents were busy with the crime scene, the young woman's name was Angie, and she was also a bloodivore. Without arguing, Angie grabbed her purse and followed the group to the bank. The next moment, they were inside, holding everyone hostage and making sure no one called the police. To hide their identities, they wore masks that partially covered their faces. When Kao was responsible for guarding the hostages while Mai Lu and Angie searched for the safe to steal the money. When they found the safe, Angie discovered it had a 12-digit lock that could not be opened by conventional means. When Kao threatened the bank manager to reveal the password, but the manager replied that even he didn't know it, because only the main office knew the code. He explained that even if he did know, it wouldn't help, since the password changed every 24 hours. When Kao didn't believe him and threatened to kill him, but Mai Lu urged him to remain calm and said the manager was telling the truth, as he had seen this type of lock before. Fortunately, Mai Lu knew how to break the code using a special computer the bank had to operate the entire system. With this, he managed to decipher the password, and Angie quickly opened the safe. Mai Lu ran inside, but instead of taking all the money, he only took the amount they had previously planned. Angie accepted without question, but But when Ko was outraged, saying they'd risked their lives for so little and wanted more, My Lu warned him to stick to the plan or he'd be left behind. Scared, when Ko decided to flee with the others. However, just as they were about to leave, they heard a child crying, searching for his mother. The group hadn't expected there to still be a child outside the hostage area, which complicated matters, as the boy had seen when Ko's face the moment he took off his glasses. Furious, trying to convince My Lu to take more money, when Ko regretted his decision because now the only option was to kill the boy to hide his identity. Angie stepped in to stop him, which further intensified when Ko's fury, and he didn't hesitate to shoot his own companion. This forced My Lu to intervene to prevent Angie from being killed. Upon hearing the shot, Angie went into defensive mode, which triggered her bloodivore genes to activate uncontrollably. This led her to see the child as an irresistible meal in her mind. The change activated her collar, which began to emit a red glow, alerting the special forces that she was about to lose control. Angie realized she had made a terrible mistake, and that, because of her, the agents would arrive soon, potentially arresting or even eliminating her on the spot. This also put everyone in the group at risk, as they were in the detection area. At that moment, the last member, Chen Fong, appeared and announced that the getaway vehicles were ready. When Ko suggested they abandon Angie, or they would all be captured, Angie agreed, knowing she was a danger to them, and decided to stay behind. But My Lu forcibly grabbed her, put her in the vehicle, and threw the bag of money in with it. Before when Ko and Chen Fong could react, My Lu accelerated the car and fled. Soon after, special forces arrived and arrested Wen Ko and Chen Fong, while My Lu and Angie managed to escape. However, the agents were not about to let them go so easily. They threw all their resources into the pursuit and, after a manhunt that seemed to last hours, finally managed to stop and arrest them, giving them no second chance to escape. The four were taken to prison, where My Lu was placed before an investigator who pressured him to reveal everything and confess every detail of his crimes if he wanted an easier time. In the next room, when Ko shouted, accusing My Lu of being a traitor for confessing his crimes to the police, My Lu ignored him and responded to the investigator by saying that he had only committed a robbery and that this would put him in prison for 15 years. But since he was still a teenager, he would probably have 90% of his sentence reduced and would soon be free again. The investigator looked at My Lu with an amused expression and asked if he had so much confidence because of his father's position as director of BST. Instead of being proud, My Lu became serious and warned that he didn't want to hear his father's name because he didn't like to talk about him. The investigator ignored My Lu's threatening aura and insisted on knowing whether or not he would confess. My Lu said he had no problem confessing to anything, and even suggested that the investigator add more crimes to the list, since he would be convicted anyway. The investigator became enraged by his arrogance and grabbed My Lu by the collar, saying he wanted to kill him right then and there for having remorselessly caused the deaths of 15 people. My Lu didn't understand how he was involved in the deaths of 15 people, but he soon noticed the photos scattered on the floor showing the bodies of the dead hostages. Meanwhile, the court was preparing for the trial of My Lu and her associates, and her father was busy apologizing to his superiors, who questioned how he would handle his own son's crimes. My Tenju, My Lu's father, assured his superiors that he would bring justice to the victims and that he would not repeat the mistakes made when handling his wife's case. The next day, the four were taken to court, where the judge asked the prosecution to present their case. The prosecution described in detail the crime committed by the four bank robbers and explained how their brutality led to the deaths of 15 innocent people. The judge stared at My Lu and the group before announcing the verdict, declaring the death penalty for all four, with no chance of redemption. Wen Ko burst into tears upon hearing the sentence and begged the judge for pardon, claiming he had committed no crime. After the sentencing, My Lu was taken back to prison, where he met his father, who was also the director of BST. My Tenju asked his son why he had done it. Without a response, he concluded on his own that perhaps he had done it because he had found his mother, and that would change everything. Upon hearing his mother's name, My Lu lost his mind and told his father to never speak of her again, because he was unworthy of acting as a father. My Tenju was displeased with his son holding him by the collar, so he grabbed his wrist, which began to burn, and said that he would renounce him as a son anyway. After that, he left My Lu behind, lying on the ground, his wrist burned and painful. Later that night, the 4 of them, including My Lu, were placed in a police van to be taken from the prison to another location. Halfway there, the van stopped at a red light, and suddenly, a group of armed men surrounded the vehicle and began shooting without warning. Soon the shooting stopped, and the man in front fired once more at the van before fleeing. 10 years earlier, humanity was still recovering from the damage caused by the Bloodivores when the BST announced a new project to the world. The director of BST appeared in person to introduce the Child of Peace to the world. The audience didn't understand what it was and wondered if it was some kind of technology or biological weapon. Curiosity was high, as BST had never ceased to amaze the world with inventions that brought harmony to a society marked by the chaos of pharmaceutical drugs. Their doubts were soon answered when a beautiful woman took the stage accompanied by a 5-year-old child. She introduced herself as Guching Shimin, head of the research department, and informed them that the boy beside her was the Child of Peace mentioned by Mai Tenju. She explained that the boy was not an ordinary human, but rather a hybrid of human and bloodivore, a being who represented the hope of uniting the two races and eliminating the conflicts and differences between them. The revelation caused a stir in the audience, who could hardly believe that these monstrous creatures could unite with humans. Guching assured them that everything was real, as the child was the result of her collaborative work with Mai Tenju. To further boost their confidence, she explained the boy's unique characteristics that set him apart from other bloodivores. Chief among them, his lack of the aggression issues that plagued the others daily. Back in the present, My Lu awoke with a severe headache and realized she was in a steel room with 2 other people. He turned his head and thought he saw Angie, but in fact, it was a stranger. Looking around, he saw 3 backpacks next to each of them. He opened the first backpack to see its contents and found only a set of clothes and a pistol. This confused him, as moments before he had been a death row inmate, and now he was in a steel room with 2 strangers and a gun in hand. To confirm his suspicion, he decided to check the other backpacks. But when he reached for the backpack next to the other man suddenly woke up, grabbed his arm, and pushed him hard to the ground. My Lu screamed in pain, trying to free himself, but the man increased his pressure and forced him even harder against the ground, which tightened his throat and made him scream even louder. The screams woke the girl, who looked at them both in confusion and asked how she had ended up there, since she had also been sentenced to death recently. The man, thinking My Lu had already learned not to touch his belongings, released him. My Lu took a deep breath and felt the relief of air entering her lungs again. This feeling brought back memories of the night they were supposed to be transferred, but the plan went awry when an armed group surrounded the van and opened fire on them. The man in front ordered My Lu to duck as bullets tore through the vehicle, leaving it riddled with holes. He then pulled out a pistol and shot My Lu, but since he was still alive, he realized it must have been a tranquilizer. My Lu was even more confused when he realized that the other 2 beside him were also death row inmates. The woman's name was Ifan Cho and had been arrested for fraud. The man who had shot him down was Lai Xin, a professional killer captured by the BST and placed on death row. While My Lu and Ifan Cho were still trying to understand the situation, Lai Xin removed his prisoner's clothing and put on the uniform from his backpack. Lai Xin also removed some knives and swords from his backpack, confirming My Lu's hypothesis that everyone also had weapons. Just as Lai Xin was ready for combat, a loud, prolonged noise forced everyone to their knees. My Lu could only describe it as a searing pain that ran through his entire body and paralyzed every muscle, rendering him incapable of action. Luckily, the sound stopped before My Lu's head seemed to split, and he regained consciousness. Before the group could comprehend what was happening, the doors to the steel rooms opened, revealing a vast complex with dozens of similar modules, from which hundreds of bloodivores emerged. The people had varied backgrounds and profiles, but they shared a common thread. They had all been sentenced to death before being sent to the facility. My Lu concluded that her friends might also be there and prepared to look for them, but the main door to the courtyard opened, revealing a young woman who appeared to be Angie. My Lu almost called out to her, but the real Angie grabbed his arm from behind and explained that the figure in front of her was an imposter, and that she, standing next to him, was the real person, asking him to avoid confusion and simply listen to the presentation. The fake Angie scanned the crowd and welcomed Aori. She announced that all death sentences had been revoked, and that from that moment on, everyone would live free within the prison unit called Aori. She then introduced the concept of Aori, a special prison created to permanently house that population. The Bloodivores, who had briefly warmed to the idea of forgiveness, were outraged when they learned they would remain there forever, which for many seemed worse than a quick death. A slovenly-looking man took the stage and, in an intimidating tone, demanded a way out. threatening to humiliate the host in front of everyone. The imposter maintained her posture and didn't react, which further angered the attacker, who grabbed her by the shoulders and tried to expose her to embarrass her. At that moment, Chen Fong jumped onto the stage and kicked the attacker away, unaware that Angie was a fake and risking his own safety to protect her dignity. Chen Fong took off his coat and covered the imposter, which infuriated the attacker, who grabbed him and threw him against a column. Chen Fong prepared to retaliate, but Mai Lu noticed something unusual about the monitoring collars and warned him not to fight. Chen Fong trusted Mai Lu's judgment, focusing solely on defending himself. Mai Lu's scream drew the attention of the attacker's accomplices, who pulled guns from their backpacks and threatened him, until they noticed the real Angie nearby and, excited by the discovery of another woman in such a hostile environment, began to see her as a target. Mai Lu considered various possible actions when Ko appeared and pointed a shotgun at the man threatening him. The attacker retreated, realizing that Ko might shoot if he made any reckless movements. But Ko intervened not out of altruism, but because he wanted to know about the deaths of the 15 people and understand how everyone had ended up there. Mai Lu only gave a rueful smile, as he himself didn't know what had happened to the victims. As for the transport here, he suspected it was linked to the armed attack on the van the night before. Before Mai Lu could answer Ko's questions, the assailant beating Chen Fong decided to end the violence with a single blow. But the collar around his neck began flashing red and then exploded with enough force to tear off his head. The entire courtyard was shocked, and everyone stared at their own collars in horror. The imposter, who had remained silent, resumed speaking to explain that the collars had been redesigned for Aori's facility, and that whenever a bloodivore attempted to kill another, the attacker's collar would detonate immediately. She also warned that any attempt to remove the device would activate the explosion sequence, leading to the same outcome. After explaining the ground rules, she wished those present luck, stating that they would all remain there until the end of their lives. Meanwhile, the investigator responsible for Mai Lu received news of the van attack and went to the scene to verify it personally. After examining the vehicle, the investigator assessed the brutality of the action but could not identify who had committed it. Some colleagues suggested terrorism, a hypothesis that Lai rejected after observing the way the scene had been organized. Unfortunately, the bodies of the 4 prisoners were unrecognizable, making autopsies impossible. Back in Aori, as soon as the imposter finished her warning, the entire complex shook and the door behind her shattered, revealing a monster that attacked her and tore her body in half. Chen Fong almost ran to her aid, but Mai Lu stopped him and explained that it wasn't Angie. Chen Fong looked at the ground and realized Mai Lu was right, as the figure was merely an automaton that shut down after transmitting the information to the system. The monster that had destroyed the projection began attacking other bloodivores, who tried to resist with gunfire, but the bullets didn't penetrate the creature's skin. At this, Mai Lu grabbed the real Angie's hand and began to run, looking for another exit. As he approached the opposite sector, Angie noticed something strange and stopped him. Mai Lu looked up and saw, at the top of the warehouse, several smaller creatures, identical to the one that had destroyed the imposter, but reduced in size, which further worsened the situation and spread panic among the prisoners. Ko, who was reloading his shotgun, tried to confront the creatures, but upon noticing the growing number of bodies around him, he lost all hope and considered taking his own life. He stopped when he noticed another person attempting the same thing and was decapitated by a creature before pulling the trigger. The scene made him give up the idea and flee like Mai Lu. At the other end, Mai Lu and Angie managed to reach the exit area, but a creature guarded the entrance. They waited until the monster moved away and then resumed their run. Ifen Cho, who was hiding in a steel room, spotted them and begged to be taken with her. Her voice attracted the creature, which leaped toward Mai Lu, leaving him completely exposed. The moment the monster reached Mai Lu's face, something unexpected happened. He was thrown back, and the glass panels shattered where his body passed. Lai Xin watched from afar and was surprised, recognizing the kind of power that had manifested in Mai Lu. The ability was known as hemomancy, and only a few bloodivores could wield it, which explained Lai Xin's astonishment at seeing a user of this technique in that group. Mai Lu still struggled to control her power, but managed to hold the creature back for a moment, allowing Lai Xin to join the fray and throw one of her knives at the monster's head, diverting its attention. At the front of the warehouse, the bloodivores continued to fight off the attacks, and one of them rigged an improvised explosive device with enough force to open the sealed door. Before the prisoner could attach the explosive to the door, one of the terrifying creatures lunged at him and ripped his neck out with a single blow. Chen Fong, still stunned by everything that had happened, noticed the explosive lying before him and decided to risk his life. Throwing it against the door door in the hope of opening a path to freedom. The detonation shook the entire warehouse and shattered the sealed door, revealing an escape route. The explosion also destroyed part of the steel grating on the ceiling, giving My Lu the chance to rescue Angie from the monster's clutches. He lifted her off the ground and leaped toward the ceiling, believing they could use the ventilation ducts to escape. This left only Ifan Cho on the ground, who once again begged to be saved. My Lu looked at her and ordered Angie to get the gun from her backpack to distract the creature while he tried to rescue Ifan Cho. Angie didn't hesitate and began firing at the monster, which retreated enough for My Lu to pull Ifan Cho out and take her with it. The monster, however, wasn't about to let them escape easily and lunged to grab them, but Angie reacted quickly and shot at the cables holding a heavy load. The impact caused the weight to fall on the creature, knocking it down. After saving Angie and Ifan Cho, My Lu turned to Lai Xin and asked if he needed help. Lai Xin refused, telling him to just mind his own business, as he could face those monsters alone. His words were true, not because he didn't want help, but because those monsters truly didn't pose much of a threat to him. Using the assassin techniques he had mastered throughout his life, Lai Xin single-handedly fought off a group of the creatures. Meanwhile, Chen Feng and the rest of the Bloodivores managed to escape the warehouse, but instead of finding open air, they found themselves inside a building surrounded by high walls, faced with yet another dead end and low on ammunition. They saw the monsters approaching again, ready to attack. Meanwhile, My Lu, Angie, and Ifan Cho were making their way through the ventilation ducts and reached a crossroads with several exits. Angie suggested they split up, but My Lu rejected the idea because it would be too risky, as they had no way to communicate. He noticed Angie's strange behavior from the moment he saw him use his hemomancy powers, so he decided to ask her why the automaton that looked like her had appeared and if she knew anything about the place. Angie didn't answer and instead asked My Lu why she had never told him about her powers before. My Lu explained that hemomancy was extremely rare, and that perhaps that was precisely why they had been taken there. He also expressed curiosity about the facility and the monsters, as it all seemed part of a grand experiment. He concluded that he needed to survive to discover the truth. My Lu asked for the gun back from Angie. She hesitated, but then handed it over. He removed all the bullets and fired them in different directions until he realized where the crashing sounds were coming from, which indicated the correct exit from the ducts. Once he found the path, he handed the gun back to Angie and continued on. In the other group, some Bloodivores were already at their limit, cornered by the monsters. With no alternative, some hemomancers unleashed their powers and created a wall of steel and metal to seal the breach caused by the explosion. My Lu, Angie, and Ifan Cho finally found a way out and fell into a dusty office that appeared to have been long abandoned by its previous occupants. While searching for clues, My Lu noticed that Angie's blouse was torn and alerted her, making her feel embarrassed as she tried to cover herself. My Lu quickly turned away, pretending to need food or water, and headed to another room. There, he rummaged through the objects left behind and concluded that the residents had evacuated in a hurry. Digging deeper, he found a construction map on the wall and realized that, based on the date indicated, the building should have been completed within 2 years. This further confused him, as the state of the place indicated it had been abandoned for at least 50 years. This contradiction reminded him of something important. The fake Angie had named that place Aori, and My Lu knew the name well, as it was the island where the school where he had spent much of his childhood was located. At the time, he was the only Bloodivore student at the school and wore a monitoring collar, but he still had friends and a happy life. One day, however, a rogue Bloodivore attacked the campus, prompting the teacher to organize the evacuation. When it was My Lu's turn to leave, the teacher said his father had ordered him to leave him in the classroom. My Lu begged to be taken away, but the teacher ignored him and left with the other students. The rogue Bloodivore found My Lu and took him hostage to negotiate with the BST. He took him to the roof and asked Mai Tenju, My Lu's father, to appear. Mai Tenju didn't go personally, sending only a drone for the negotiations. The attacker presented his demands and promised to release My Lu if they were met, but Mai Tenju replied that no one could leave Aori, even if he wanted to comply. The Bloodivore asked if he didn't care about his own son, and Mai Tenju replied that he was no more important than BST protocols. The attacker lamented that not even Mai Lu's father cared about him and recalled that teachers and classmates had betrayed him by revealing his whereabouts, making it easier to find him. Disillusioned at not being able to meet his demands, the Bloodivore decided to end Mai Lu's life before being eliminated by the BST and threw him from the roof, believing he would die a quick death. However, before hitting the ground, Mai Lu awakened her hemomancy powers and managed to survive. Back in the present, Ifan Cho and Angie were exchanging clothes when Ifan Cho asked why Angie had been sentenced to death. Angie told her story, and Ifan Cho showed compassion, revealing that she herself was on death row because she had killed her own husband. Ifan Cho added that this wasn't the first time, as despite being only a few years older than Angie, she had been married 4 times and, each time, killed her husbands because she couldn't bear to see them taken from her by other women. While the Bloodivores struggled to survive the living hell in Aori, Inspector Lai continued to investigate clues about the missing individuals. After gathering records of all the missing Bloodivores, Inspector Lai verified several points. The first point indicated that all the individuals were Bloodivores. The second point showed that they were all on death row and would soon be executed. The third point revealed that they had all disappeared without a trace. If the case had involved only Mai Lu and his group, Inspector Lai wouldn't have been so alarmed. But since the situation involved hundreds of Bloodivores, he decided to fully engage in the search. To search for clues, he tried to search for Mai Lu's name in the database and realized he couldn't access it. So he investigated the other 3 in the group and discovered that they were all orphans from the same institution. The orphanage was notorious for housing only Bloodivore orphans. Inspector Lai felt he was getting closer to the truth and decided to delve deeper into the investigation of Mai Lu and her friends. Meanwhile, Mai Lu and the 2 girls decided to carefully navigate the building to find a way out. But nothing relevant emerged other than the fact that they went up and down, and regardless of the route, they always returned to the 4th floor. The girls were confused, but Mai Lu offered a hypothesis. Mai Lu explained that they might be in a space-time intersection that isolated the place from the rest of the world. Ifan Cho found the theory unlikely, but Mai Lu remained convinced because it was the only explanation that fit the circumstances. Elsewhere in the complex, Chen Fong and Wen Kao stood behind a metal wall that was the only barrier between them and the creatures. The Hemamancer supporting the structure was already showing signs of fatigue and ordered everyone to use their own bodies to hold the wall in place. The solution was only temporary, as they would soon run out of strength and the creatures would win by attrition. Desperation took over, and one of the Bloodivores decided to take his own life with a grenade. The commotion caused panic, and the group rushed to stop him, but the man refused to drop the device. Wen Kao saw no alternative and fired his shotgun to prevent the explosion. When Wen Kao regained consciousness, he realized he had killed someone, which brought him to tears, while the others recognized that he had just saved many lives. Chen Fong tried to console Wen Kao and recalled their childhood, when they were both beaten by a group of boys, but Wen Kao stood up to the attackers, which, despite the painful outcome, made Chen Fong feel proud of his friend. A sense of responsibility rekindled, as he was the eldest of the 4 orphans, and he decided to act. Chen Fong asked the Hemamancer to open a rift so he could pass through the wall, as he intended to detonate the barrier and resolve the impasse. The Hemamancer found the idea strange, as there were dozens of creatures on the other side. Back with Mai Lu and the 2 girls, the trio continued forward, already aware that they wouldn't be able to leave the 4th floor by conventional means. As they walked, Ifan Cho asked if Mai Lu could use Hemamancy to transport them upward. Mai Lu replied that the power worked within a 10-meter radius and wasn't omnipotent, as it required creating a gravity point first and then falling toward that point. Mai Lu added that if the gravity point aligned with a long, straight axis, it could accelerate too much, and upon collision, nothing would be left of itself. At that moment, a creature appeared ahead, and Mai Lu became alert. Mai Lu ordered the 2 of them to run while he restrained the enemy. After observing Lai Xin in combat, Mai Lu had learned that piercing the head was the best way to avoid its fangs and inflict damage at the same time. Mai Lu grabbed a metal bar, created a gravity point, and propelled her body upward, and then downward to drive the tip into the creature's skull. The impact disturbed the monster, but was not lethal. If it had been a single opponent, Mai Lu could have held it off. But another creature appeared unexpectedly and forced the girls to run in the opposite direction. Ifan Cho found a side door and called Angie to follow her. But upon entering the room, Ifan Cho pushed Angie out and closed the door, leaving Angie outside. The creature struck Angie, opening a deep wound in her abdomen. When Mai Lu arrived, he saw that Angie had already lost a lot of blood. Mai Lu lifted her and decided to take a calculated risk. He positioned a gravity point in a straight line to double his speed, knowing he could shatter if he lost control. Luckily, he managed to grab a bar in his path and lessen the impact. The creature in his path was pierced by the same metal, but the second monster continued to pursue, so My Lu repeated the strategy to gain distance and find a room where he could take shelter. At that moment, Ifan Cho, who had betrayed Angie, opened the door and extended her hand for My Lu to pull her in as well, but My Lu ignored her. Just as she had ignored Angie, Ifan Cho was overcome with terror when she realized she had been left behind. Meanwhile, Qin Feng, who had asked the Hemamancer to open a passage and had been denied, decided to climb the wall and look for empty spaces to escape. The structure, made of metal containers, was unstable, and the additional weight displaced a module, which fell towards the bloodivores supporting the barrier. They managed to dodge in time, but the shock and the nearness of death sparked widespread outrage, and everyone began to curse Qin Feng. Qin Feng ignored the complaints and reached the top of the wall, but faced another challenge, as the gaps between the containers were narrow and barely passable. The unstable base made everything vibrate with each step. Back at My Lu, the impact left marks, and using the gravity point in a straight line revealed the high risk of the technique. As soon as he caught his breath, My Lu rushed to assess Angie's condition, who continued to bleed. My Lu had to resort to extreme measures to staunch the wound. He dismantled a round, removed the gunpowder, and spread it over the open skin of Angie's abdomen. Then he rubbed 2 stones together to produce sparks until he ignited the gunpowder and cauterized the wound. The pain was intense, and Angie screamed as the skin burned and quickly closed. After sealing the wound, My Lu observed the creature that had been pierced by the iron bar. The monster struggled for a few moments and then dissolved into blue light, making My Lu question the nature of these entities. In Qin Feng's sector, the passage through the fragile containers became critical when the entire wall began to shake violently and the surrounding modules compressed. Qin Feng knew he would be crushed if he didn't get out immediately, but time was short and space was limited. At the last second, a man appeared and pulled Qin Feng out. Qin Feng tried to thank him, but the red-haired man pinned him against the wall and immobilized him, demanding to know where they were. Qin Feng admitted he didn't know, assuming it was a prison facility. The man showed suspicion and increased his pressure on Qin Feng's neck. He then asked about Mai Tenju and if he had seen him there. Meanwhile, Mai Tenju was summoned to a private meeting with senior members of the organization who questioned his motives in handing over the sapphire artifact to his own son. Mai Tenju stated that the timing wasn't ideal and that he had therefore placed his hopes in My Lu. Justifying his decision, his superiors were dissatisfied, but Mai Tenju assured them it was the right choice given their blood ties. After the tension subsided, Mai Tenju withdrew and, a few steps away, used the communicator to order the weapons to be removed, stating that the situation was under control. From the beginning, Mai Tenju had no fear of his superiors because he had planned everything. Finally, back in My Lu's sector, he picked up a bar from the floor and began to slam it against the wall, hoping to clear a path. A regular bar lacked the strength to pierce the material, much less create a hole for a person to pass through. My Lu felt the weight of despair and mentally revisited every event since the robbery, trying to find some forgotten detail that would point to a way out. My Lu began to question his own strength and whether he could truly save Angie from that hell. At that moment, his gaze fell on the wrist his father had burned when they were in prison. In the place of the scar now glowed a jewel that My Lu recognized as an intelligent computer. He activated the device, and a 360-degree hologram appeared around him. To test the functions, he researched bloodivores and was surprised to see countless projected data on attacks and incidents involving these creatures. He then researched blood transfusions between bloodivores and discovered that it was possible, but that the side effects could drive the recipient into a frenzy. When researching his own blood, the computer informed him that, because he was half human and half bloodivore, his blood was even more valuable, as it contained a tranquilizing effect on the recipient. This revelation gave My Lu hope of saving Angie. He then researched Aori, as he saw this place as the root of all the problems. The computer revealed that Aori was formerly a district called Aoka, where 43 years ago the first anti-insomnia medicine had been developed. However, the side effects turned the residents into bloodivores, forcing the government to seal off the district. The situation spiraled out of control, and in the end, the government destroyed the entire place with weapons of mass destruction. Upon learning about Aoka, My Lu researched death row inmates, but found nothing because the files were password protected. He didn't know what the password was, so he could only speculate as to why they were in Aori. My Lu knew he needed to find more clues, But at that moment, all that mattered was healing Angie, so he slit his own wrist and let her feed on his blood to regain what he had lost. Meanwhile, Chen Fong was at the mercy of a red-haired man who didn't believe anything he said. Chen Fong begged him to understand the danger, because there were indeed monsters in the warehouse too terrifying for them to face alone. The red-haired man, amused, tossed him aside and grabbed a grenade. As he examined the artifact, a monster suddenly appeared, trying to enter through the cracks in the metal wall. Chen Fong broke out in a cold sweat, but the man remained calm. The monster leaped at them, and the red-haired man destroyed it with a single punch. The force not only pulverized the creature, but also crumbled the wall the Hemomancer had erected. When the dust settled, everyone saw the red-haired man amid dozens of monsters, showing no sign of fear. To others, those monsters were a living nightmare, but to him, they seemed like just another ordinary day. No matter how many appeared, they were all destroyed with punches and kicks. Finally, only one remained, which he eliminated by plunging the grenade into its stomach. While everyone tried to guess who the man was, the Hemomancer, more informed than the others, recognized him. He stated that this was Liao, the most feared as level criminal in BST history. For the other bloodivores, the revelation was shocking, as figures like him were seen almost as heroes. At that moment, Angie, who had been gently feeding on Mai Lu's blood, began to twitch, and his eyes turned red. Mai Lu remembered the side effects mentioned by the computer and tried to prepare himself, but he didn't have time. Angie pounced on him and bit his neck forcefully, sucking until he was satisfied. Mai Lu passed out from blood loss, and Angie fell asleep soon after. A shadowy, female figure approached Mai Lu, caressed his face, and disappeared without him noticing. On the battlefield, Liao had finished defeating the creatures when he was surprised by an attack from Lai Xin, who was determined to kill him. But each of Lai Xin's attempts was easily countered by Liao, who counterattacked as if facing a child. Lai Xin persisted, trying different ways to surprise him, and a few times he almost hit his head, but was always thrown away. Liao taunted Lai Xin, calling him weak even after so many years. Lai Xin felt his anger rising, but he could do nothing and simply bottled it up. Disappointed, Liao turned to the Hemomancer, who began to fawn over him through fear. Liao demanded that he stop talking and simply explain what was happening. The Hemomancer told him about the special colors that prevented them from killing each other, and mentioned the man who had tried to kill Chen Fong and ended up with his head blown off. Liao found this strange and decided to test it. He struck the Hemomancer with full force and slammed him against the wall. The number on Liao's collar changed from 399 to 400, and Chen Fong realized this meant he had killed 400 people. Why the collar hadn't exploded, only Liao seemed to know. Meanwhile, Mai Lu dreamed of the mother she had last seen as a child. Though the memories were vague, they were the most precious he had. He woke up and saw Angie unconscious beside him. He also noticed that the nearby wall had broken, revealing an exit. Mai Lu put Angie on his back and walked carefully along a narrow ledge barely large enough for one person. He walked slowly, trying to keep Angie steady. Soon, she regained consciousness and said she didn't remember what had happened after she passed out, except for feeding on his blood. Mai Lu asked him to consider it a nightmare and not to worry. Angie, confused, wanted to know why he was so kind to her. Mai Lu said that from their first meeting at the orphanage, he had been determined to protect her. He remembered being outside when he saw Chen Fong and Wen Kao playing together. He was suspicious, but when he looked at Angie, he immediately remembered his mother and began to cry. At that moment, Angie gave him his favorite stuffed rabbit to calm him down, and that's when Mai Lu decided to protect her even if it meant risking his life. He acknowledged that it might be selfish, but that's how he felt. Angie didn't blame him, because she knew Mai Lu was different from them. They were orphans from the orphanage, but Mai Lu wasn't. Mai Lu was about to tell Angie the truth when a flying monster flew past them, startling him and making him immediately jump into a defensive position to protect her. Meanwhile, Lu Yao looked at Lai Xin in his new clothes and asked where he had gotten them. Lai Xin didn't want to answer and simply walked away, which left Lu Yao a little disappointed. Chen Fong, meanwhile, was searching for clean clothes in his backpack, having given his coat to the fake Angie, who was later killed by one of the creatures. Before he could put on the clothes, Lu Yao approached and took the set, returning only his old prisoner clothes. Chen Fong had no choice but to accept this open robbery, as he was too weak to face this monster in human form. Back to Mai Lu, he resumed walking after the flying monster disappeared into the distance. But after a few steps, Angie began coughing and breathing heavily, forcing Mai Lu to stop and let her rest for a while. Angie suggested he leave her behind, as it would only slow him down, but Mai Lu told her she'd seen the location of an infirmary on a map, and urged her to hold out until they got there. Angie nodded weakly and laid her head on his shoulder. She asked him to look after Chen Fong and Wen Kao, her only family in the world, and also confessed her love, as this might be the last time she'd have the chance to speak to him. Meanwhile, Lu Yao dressed appropriately so as not to walk naked in front of the other bloodivores and decided to explore Aori. He said they should all give up their dreams and accept death, as they were nothing more than useless. Even so, several bloodivores decided to follow him, and Wen Kao was the first to show support, starting a sort of march of followers. Chen Fong tried to stop him, reminding him that they still needed to find Angie and Mai Lu, but Wen Kao didn't care, saying that Mai Lu had already betrayed them. As for Angie, he declared that since he couldn't win her heart, Chen Fong could woo her at will. Chen Fong couldn't deny it, as he truly loved Angie. After Wen Kao left, Lai Xin approached Chen Fong and told him that she had seen Mai Lu escape through a ventilation shaft with 2 girls, and that perhaps it would still be possible to reach him if he hadn't died. Meanwhile, Mai Lu carried Angie on her back again and walked slowly toward the infirmary. To keep her from losing hope, he began to talk about his past, explaining that his father was a director of BST and his mother was an ordinary human, making him an anomaly, half human, half bloodivore. He explained that he was called the Child of Peace and explained why he approached the orphanage even though he wasn't an orphan. He said that after his mother disappeared, he searched for clues and found only a few donation certificates for the orphanage, which led him there. It was there that he met Angie and the other 2, and thus their story began. While Mai Lu reminisced about her life, Inspector Lai visited the orphanage where Angie, Chen Fong, and Wen Kao had grown up. The place had been closed for a few years and put up for sale after the director's death. The inspector was disappointed not to be able to speak to anyone with recent information, but an elderly employee led him to the orphanage's records. On the way, he noticed a box full of toys. He picked up a stuffed rabbit with its head sewn shut, ripped open the seam, and found a small device inside, which he quickly pocketed. Meanwhile, Chen Fong followed Lai Xin, asking him which conduit Mai Lu had used and where he was going. Lai Xin became irritated and begged him to remain silent, but Chen Fong continued to insist, asking about his connection with Lu Yao and why he hadn't tried to kill him. Lai Xin replied that it was none of his business and that he wasn't in a position to question anything. Chen Fong stopped asking, but continued to follow him through the warehouse. After a while, they came across a pile of dead monsters, and Lai Xin wondered if it had been Lu Yao's doing. The 2 continued on, but soon the corpses began to dissolve into blue light. Lai Xin was shocked and asked if it was Chen Fong's doing, but Chen Fong denied it and said he didn't understand what was happening. During the observation, Chen Fong found a human-shaped crystal made of blood in one of the bodies. Intrigued, he picked it up, but as he stared at it, his heart raced, and he lost control. Lai Xin took the crystal to examine it, but found nothing special. Shortly after, the crystal melted into a pool of blood, and Lai Xin concluded it must be some kind of crystallized blood. The fact that such objects appeared inside the creatures raised even more questions in his mind, especially about the bloodmancers. Therefore, he decided to agree to Chen Fong's request to search for Mai Lu, as he also believed he was one of the most enigmatic prisoners and might hold answers. He also remembered what the fake Angie had said about survival on the island, and concluded that some of the answers might lie with Mai Lu and Angie, who resembled the robot. Back at Inspector Lai's, he took the toy box to the office and discovered that they all contained identical devices. When he plugged one of the devices into his computer, he heard a recording of 4 young people talking. He recognized the voices as those of Mai Lu and her group, who were talking about robbing a bank to raise money and save the orphanage from being sold to brokers. Wen Kao was wary, but Mai Lu assured them that the plan was perfect and that they wouldn't be caught if they followed his instructions. He also reassured Angie, who seemed the most worried, reminding her that everything would be done to help the children at the orphanage. Meanwhile, Mai Lu finally found a ramp and began to carefully descend with Angie on her back. However, before she could put her foot down, Angie slipped and fell. Mai Lu rushed to help her, but was overcome by intense pain in his head as he heard countless different voices echoing inside his mind. The voices forced Mai Lu to his knees, his breathing becoming heavy. Before he could rest, a monster emerged, and Mai Lu snarled at it, his eyes filled with bloodlust. While Mai Lu fought the creature, Chen Fong and Lai Xin finally reached the hallway where Ifan Kao had died as Mai Lu tried to save Angie by fighting the monsters. However, they found no bodies, only signs of combat. The 2 were searching for the trio when a shrill noise forced them to cover their ears in pain. Lai Xin managed to cope a little better and grabbed a metal object to identify the source of the sound. The noise seemed to be coming from a nearby room, so he opened the door and the noise stopped. stopped. Meanwhile, My Lu used his hemamancy to its fullest and tore the monster apart, but another soon appeared and attacked him. My Lu was about to confront it when he noticed a third approaching Angie. He tried to run towards her, but was grabbed by one of the monsters, preventing him from advancing. The third monster trapped Angie in its mouth and showed signs of fleeing. My Lu lost consciousness after the incident, and when he woke up, he was on the floor with a yellow-haired girl on top of him. The girl ran as soon as she realized he was awake, leaving My Lu alone in the room. He got up and began to survey the room. From the equipment and utensils, he realized he was in a fast food restaurant. My Lu didn't remember much and felt as if he'd lost part of his memory, so he could only wander, trying to recall the past. Leaving the first room, he reached the main hall, where he found Angie still unconscious, protected by Qin Fang and Lai Xin. Qin Fang was furious upon seeing My Lu and began questioning him for not protecting Angie, even though he'd promised to give his life for her. My Lu recognized the three of them, which meant he hadn't lost all his memories. However, he couldn't answer because he had truly failed to protect her. Qin Fang became even more enraged by his silence and began punching him in the face to vent his anger. At first, My Lu endured it without reacting, but then lost her patience and returned the blows. Lai Xin simply watched without intervening. Soon, the two grew tired of the fight and began to cry. After the tears dried, they sat down and tried to talk more calmly. Qin Fang admitted that he had also lost some of his memory and blamed My Lu for dragging them into this situation, but he abandoned the argument when he realized there was no point in dwelling on the past. He got up and left, saying he was going to see Angie, but in reality, he just wanted a place to cry alone. My Lu, for her part, remembered walking along the ledge with Angie and noticing that everything that fell disappeared into a mysterious space, which reinforced her suspicion that they were trapped in a space-time intersection. Meanwhile, Lu Yao used the group of useless followers to do the heavy work. When Ko, reduced to an obedient servant, followed every order without question, Lu Yao only smiled as he watched them work. At the same time, the yellow-haired girl would sneak into Angie's room, lick her face, and then fall asleep on her pillows. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, Angie opened her eyes. As soon as she woke up, she began walking through the building and found the exit, emerging outside. This alerted My Lu, who saw the door open and decided to check. Looking outside, she was shocked to see Angie standing before him, healthy and sound. Before she could say anything, Chen Fong appeared and rushed to hug her, crying in fear of losing her again. After calming down, Chen Fong released her, and My Lu checked on her, confirming that she was fine and out of danger. Angie was confused by their surprise, but Chen Fong explained that when they found her, she wasn't breathing. Angie was shaken and said she only remembered a few things. As her memory was clouded, Chen Fong urged her not to force herself and to rest. After reassuring Angie, Chen Fong heard her ask about the yellow-haired girl who was lying on top of her when she woke up, and who had even bitten her hand. Chen Fong was surprised and said that Yea couldn't have done that, as she was just a harmless child. Angie didn't know who Yea was, so Chen Fong explained how they had found her. He explained that he and Lai Xin heard a loud noise coming from a room and, upon entering, noticed that parts of the room glowed yellow, as if melting. Lai Xin tested it by touching the liquid with the tip of her knife, which instantly melted. This frightened Chen Fong, who wanted to leave, but Lai Xin suspected something was ahead and insisted. It was then that they found Yea sleeping on the floor. Concerned, they picked her up and left before the room completely melted. As for her name, they gave her to her because she could only repeat it as Yea. As they spoke, Yea herself appeared on the upper floor of the building, startling Chen Fong, who asked her to come down. But Yea defied him and jumped on his face. When he tried to chase her, she hid behind Angie, who shielded her. Chen Fong gave up, unable to punish her in front of Angie. My Lu, who had remained silent, expressed curiosity about the melting room and asked Chen Fong to take him there. Chen Fong agreed and went with him, while Angie stayed behind with Lai Xin and Yea. My Lu didn't bother leaving them, as they now had a receiver to communicate remotely. On the way to the room, My Lu and Chen Fong encountered two armed members of Lu Yao's group. They hid behind a broken wall to avoid being seen. At that moment, Angie contacted them via the receiver and delivered bad news. She said that Yea's collar displayed a countdown of 5, and if it wasn't increased, Yea would be in danger. They had discovered that the countdown could be extended by killing monsters. Lu Yao's collar displayed the number 400, meaning he had already killed 400. To save Yao, Mai Lu would need to help her kill some creatures and increase the count. First, Mai Lu and Chen Fong needed to get away from the immediate problem, as the transmitter's noise attracted the attention of two members of Lu Yao's group, who advanced on them. The two opened fire immediately, but Mai Lu used her hemomancy to deflect the bullets. He claimed they weren't enemies and only wanted to find Lu Yao. The pair recognized Chen Fong as the one responsible for blowing up the door, and, therefore, agreed to lead them to Lu Yao, but kept the two hostage, walking behind them with their guns drawn. However, what they didn't expect was for a monster to emerge from behind and devour them both. Mai Lu barely managed to save Chen Fong, as the creature with the enormous tongue nearly swallowed him too. Meanwhile, when Ko led Lu Yao's group in an attempt to capture a giant wolf-like monster, they bound it with chains, trying to restrain it, but the monster was too strong and managed to break some of them. Fortunately, Mai Lu and Chen Fong arrived in time and helped Wen Ko escape the creature's wrath. However, Wen Ko showed no gratitude and simply began aggressively interrogating Mai Lu ignored the complaints and focused on using his power to confront the beast. He launched himself into the air, grabbed one of the chains, and used it to smash the creature against the ground, raising a cloud of dust that obscured everyone's vision. When the dust settled, Mai Lu realized the monster was no ordinary creature, but a young bloodivore who had transformed after coming into contact with a human-shaped blood crystal, which melted in his hands, causing the mutation. Mai Lu was interested in the incident but dismissed the matter. As his main objective was to find Lu Yao, he asked to be taken to him, but Wen Ko intervened, demanding that he leave. Mai Lu reminded Wen Ko that she didn't care what he said, and that she only wanted to find Lu Yao. Wen Ko felt humiliated for always losing the spotlight to Mai Lu. In the end, one of the members of Lu Yao's group led Mai Lu and Chen Fong to his room. Along the way, Chen Fong remembered the blood crystal that had also melted in Lai Xin's hands, which worried Mai Lu, as she suspected that the blood was an agent capable of awakening the Bloodmancer's powers. Despite their concern, they couldn't dwell on it now, as they needed to speak with Lu Yao. Soon they reached his room, and Mai Lu caught his attention by mentioning Lai Xin's awakening. At first, Lu Yao wasn't interested, as he was busy with his own pleasures, but upon hearing Lai Xin's name, he opened the door and demanded to know what had happened. Mai Lu was about to explain when she came across Ifan Ko alive. She noticed the surprise in his eyes and scoffed, saying he seemed shocked to see her whole. Mai Lu ignored the provocation and returned to talking to Lu Yao about Lai Xin, taking the opportunity to say he was there to propose a deal. He explained about the counter on the collars and the need to kill monsters to increase it. Normally, Mai Lu could eliminate monsters alone, but this time he wanted to help Yaya defeat one so she could extend her leash. To do so, he needed more weapons, which he knew Lu Yao had in abundance. Mai Lu's insight amused him and showed him his secret arsenal. Mai Lu wasn't surprised, but he was pleased, as it was exactly what he needed. Meanwhile, Angie was searching for Yaya and found her hiding under a table. She bent down to see what was happening and came across Lai Xin, whose entire body seemed covered in sharp swords. At that moment, Yaya made a noise that caught his attention, as he was fighting his frenzy. Upon noticing Angie and Yaya, Lai Xin lost control and charged at them, destroying part of the building with his blades. In desperation, Angie could only search for the transmitter to ask Mai Lu for help. Meanwhile, Lu Yao agreed to give Mai Lu the weapons, but imposed one condition: he must help him. He led Mai Lu to a back door that revealed a terrifying rift in space. He asked if Mai Lu knew what it was, and Mai Lu replied that she had seen it, but didn't know what it was. Lu Yao explained that it was the containment shield keeping everyone trapped in Aori, and that if they wanted to escape, they would need to break it. He knew Mai Lu was a powerful hemomancer and wanted to make a deal to break the space-time barrier. Lu Yao extended his hand, but Mai Lu didn't shake it, merely giving a verbal agreement before stepping away. Lu Yao wouldn't let him escape so easily and threw him into the rift, but Mai Lu, already alert, used her hemomancy to dodge and push Lu Yao instead. Lu Yao was startled but managed to stabilize himself before being swallowed. This gave Mai Lu enough time to throw a grenade, create a smokescreen, and escape with Chen Fong. From the explosion, Lu Yao and Ifan Ko emerged unharmed, and Lu Yao, far from being irritated, was amused by the escape, as it made things more interesting for him. Mai Lu, for his part, knew he had only escaped because Lu Yao had gone easy on him. So when Chen Fong asked what kind of deal she had made, Mai Lu replied that Lu Yao wanted her help capturing a monster, but she had refused because there was no such thing as a free lunch in that world. She explained that her plan was to have Yao kill a monster herself, and if everything went well, they would have nothing to worry about. Chen Fong, however, felt even more suspicious, remembering that the last time My Lu had devised a plan, they had all ended up in prison and were now trapped in this cursed land. My Lu also said that another reason for fleeing was that Ifan Ko seemed to have hemomancy powers capable of reading people's minds, which could put everyone at risk. Meanwhile, Inspector Lai continued his investigation at the orphanage and finally found the records, discovering that My Lu's mother had been making donations under a false name. Initially, his assistant thought it was money laundering, but realized that the money sent to the orphanage never went anywhere else. Furthermore, even after My Lu's mother's death, the donations continued to be made monthly. Inspector Lai still didn't know how this related to the prisoner's disappearance, so he decided to smoke a cigarette to clear his head. Realizing he was out of cigarettes, he got out of the car for some fresh air. At that moment, a container fell on the vehicle, completely crushing it. Inspector Lai realized his life was in danger and began running for cover. This immediate reaction ultimately saved his life, as a sniper had him in his sights from atop a building. Losing sight of the target, the sniper signaled for the ground troops to finish the job. However, Inspector Lai had already anticipated something like this and drew his weapon, waiting for the attackers. Even though he was prepared, he was wounded by a bullet, but managed to take down one of the enemies in the process. Chadit said, My Lu immediately bent down to check if the man had any identification and found the BST card, which confirmed that the BST itself was after him for investigating the missing inmate's case too deeply. Meanwhile, Angie managed to escape the building with Yaya, who couldn't remain silent, allowing Lai Xin to catch up with them again. However, some monsters appeared and caught his attention, and he began chasing them to kill them. Angie tried to seize the opportunity to escape, but her speed was still slow, and Lai Xin finished eliminating the creatures in a few seconds and caught up with her again. My Lu arrived at the last moment and knocked Lai Xin away with a blow, and Qin Feng quickly explained to Angie that they intended to use explosions to knock down a monster and thus secure points for Yaya in order to stabilize the caller's count. While My Lu held Lai Xin, Qin Feng led Angie and Yaya to the building where they had seen the large tentacle monsters. Based on previous experience, My Lu believed the creature wouldn't leave. My Lu also taunted Lai Xin to lure him there, understanding that this was the only way to tire him out, as facing him head-on would be unwise. At another point, Lu Yao planned for Wen Ko and the others to capture a monster, wanting to see what My Lu could do on her own. My Lu managed to lead Lai Xin to the building's creature, and the gamble paid off, as the tentacle grabbed Lai Xin and dragged him inside. Qin Feng took Angie and Yaya to the building and waited for My Lu to return, but the screams and the shaking of the ground made everyone realize that the situation was about to get complicated. My Lu realized the same thing when she saw Lai Xin easily tear apart the monster's tentacle, forcing the creature out into the open. This alarmed My Lu. My Lu grabbed Lai Xin to try to push him back as far as possible, but Lai Xin was already out of control and charged at the larger monster. My Lu wasn't worried about Lai Xin's safety. She was worried that Lai Xin would kill that particular creature, because the team needed her to complete the plan and save Yaya. Therefore, even at risk to her life, My Lu persisted in using different tactics to restrain him. Angie watched from a distance and was pained to see My Lu injured, so she tried to get Lai Xin's attention, but she overestimated her own capabilities and was nearly pierced by one of Lai Xin's blades. She only escaped because Chen Fong lunged forward and took the blow to the shoulder. This wasn't fatal, but didn't stop Lai Xin from attempting to finish the attack. At the last moment, My Lu returned, dragged Lai Xin away, and slammed him into the concrete structure to slow him down. However, Lai Xin's bladed body wouldn't yield to normal impact. Angie tried to help, but Chen Fong held her back and reminded her that My Lu was risking her life to protect her, and that she needed to protect herself and retreat. However, Angie decided she didn't want to live with regret and would make her own decisions, even if it meant risking it. At that moment, Yaya dropped the bag of grenades My Lu had set aside to eliminate the monster from the building and secure the necessary points for herself. Angie understood that even if they couldn't stop Lai Xin directly, the grenades could create an opening. Angie grabbed a grenade and ran toward My Lu, who urged her to throw it to the left to create space between him and Lai Xin. But Lai Xin's reflexes were too quick, and the grenade deflected back toward My Lu, nearly stopping Angie's heart. This shock awakened something in Angie. Her eyes turned red, and the silhouette of that mysterious woman appeared before her, and the grenade that was supposed to hit Mai Lu ricocheted back toward Lai Xin. The explosion threw them both to the ground, and Angie collapsed emotionally because everything had happened before her. Angie tried to wake Mai Lu, who remained motionless with blood pooling around her head, and then saw Lai Xin, still in a frenzy, approaching. Overcome with rage and fear, Angie picked up a sword from the ground and attempted to finish Lai Xin off, but Mai Lu regained consciousness at the last second and blocked the blow. Later, Angie apologized to Mai Lu for nearly killing Lai Xin and for creating so much trouble for him and Chen Fong, but Mai Lu asserted that the important thing was for them to stay alive. Mai Lu requested the transmitter back so she could improvise a remote detonator and instructed Angie to detonate the explosives at precisely noon, no matter what. After receiving the instructions, Mai Lu entered the building to plant the charges and was almost finished when she noticed an unusual hole. She decided to go through it and found a library on the other side. In this space, Mai Lu found a decomposing corpse without a collar, which indicated it was human, a contradiction, given that all humans had been evacuated. Mai Lu continued searching and found a pendant that evoked a memory, as a woman named Zui had given it to him for his birthday. Upon opening it, Mai Lu saw her photo, confirming his suspicions. His urgency grew, and he searched for more clues until he found a diary with a password and references to a cave and a Plan B. Mai Lu entered the password into the computer and researched Plan B, obtaining data that included many children, including Angie. A monster interrupted the investigation and forced Mai Lu to resume setting the explosives, while the noise attracted Angie's attention, who feared for it. Angie, who had felt helpless moments before, awakened her own abilities and realized she was also a Hemomancer, with the power to control shadows to immobilize objects. Angie used this ability to block the monsters and clear a path for both of them to escape. Outside, when KO and his accomplices arrived to capture Chen Fong, who had previously escaped from the group. However, upon seeing Angie emerge from the building and use shadows to restrain the creature, when KO recalled events that reinforced his long-held suspicions, Mai Lu helped Angie keep the creatures at bay and ordered Chen Fong to ask Yaya to trigger the detonation to secure the points. Yaya followed the instructions and activated the device, which destroyed the building and eliminated the monsters inside, earning Yaya 50 points, enough for her survival. The explosion, however, left Mai Lu in a coma, and the situation worsened when KO pointed a gun at Angie and asked her if she had been responsible for the deaths of the hostages in the bank using shadows, a fact that would have triggered the BST and led them there. Angie didn't respond immediately, but the dust from the explosion revealed rifts in the space, from which new monsters began to emerge, forcing Wen KO to release Angie to prioritize the fight. The number of creatures was high, and the group struggled to survive while waiting for reinforcements. Mai Lu remained unconscious, and Angie wanted to protect him, but the number of enemies was too great. Lai Xin arrived in time to help with containment and dragged Mai Lu to safety, but he was seriously injured from facing so many creatures and ended up sacrificing one of his arms to save Mai Lu. Just as Lai Xin was about to lose control completely, Lu Yao appeared and neutralized him, while the team dealt with the smaller monsters, leaving only the largest one remaining. Angie tried to restrain Lu Yao with her shadows to protect Lai Xin, but he easily broke the bonds and eliminated the giant with a single attack. Inside the monster, an illusory figure appeared, taking the form of Zui, the woman who had given Mai Lu the pendant, ending the episode on a revealing note that left new questions about what would come next. This concludes the first part of this story. Like if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more videos.